May 1942. The sea off Mindanao looks almost gentle until you notice the light, thin green ribbons of plankton igniting in the wake of something small and reckless. A plywood craft, hardly longer than a city bus, slams from crest to crest, engines screaming two different notes because one belongs to a wrecked truck and the other to a fallen aircraft. The air smells of burnt aviation fuel, salt, and adrenaline. 5 men crouch low, their faces ghost-lit by instrument glow. No flags, no markings, just desperation masked as boldness. Ahead, the night hides a Japanese supply barge, blacked out against the horizon. The man at the bow grips a handle that once belonged to a fighter cockpit. His thumb trembles inside a circle of metal scavenged from a P-39's ruin. When he squeezes, the world erupts. A 37mm shell punches through air and distance, the recoil nearly launching the crew backward. For an instant, the craft's bow heels up like a breaching dolphin. Before falling hard, hullboards screaming under strain. A plume of fire folds upward from the target. Shouts echo across the channel, then vanish under the hiss of steam. The gunner gasps, not from fear, but disbelief that their invention actually works. The boat's captain throttles down one engine, fingers white on the makeshift lever, listening for the answering gunfire that never comes. Only the wash of dying embers answers. All around them spreads the smell of scorched oil and salt water. The June moon presses through clouds just long enough to paint their vessel in silver, a ridiculous hybrid of scavenged steel, tubing, and plywood plates bolted where logic said they shouldn't be. Yet here it floats, alive, spitting fire. The men exchange quick, nervous laughter that sounds more like relief. Somewhere behind the glittering wake lies the broken dock where they built this thing, hammering through monsoon nights when hope was thinner than fuel. For now they turn seaward, throttling the uneven engines toward cover among distant palms. Before you can wonder what kind of daredevil ship has just changed the night, the narration folds in. Few remember the night the first devil boat spoke. And beneath that line lingers a single unanswered question, hanging over the dark Pacific like smoke. Who built this thing? Before that night changed naval whispers, the Philippines had already been gutted by retreat. Early 1942 was a season of falling flags, of soldiers melting into jungle paths once meant for plantation roads. The United States Asiatic Fleet had scattered south. What remained around the Cavite Navy Yard were supply barges lit by burning warehouses and a skeleton crew left to improvise survival. The official term was provisional defense. Unofficially, it meant patching wreckage with prayer. Chief Machinist George Levasseur arrived here with grease in his veins and no illusions of glory. He was a farm-born mechanic from Oregon turned naval engineer, more comfortable inside an engine cowling than on parade. When communications collapsed, Levasseur and a handful of sailors found themselves caretakers of a graveyard, grounded seaplanes, holed patrol boats, generators with no fuel. Each day carried the rhythm of defeat, the scrape of wrenches echoing in bomb-scarred hangars, the distant rumble of advancing Japanese columns, and tropical rain pounding through the holes in corrugated roofs. They patched hulls because there was nothing else to do. They welded because welding drowned worry. Rumor said reinforcements were coming. Truth said otherwise. Among the men was Seaman First Class Domingo Santos, a fisherman's son from Cebu, whose every sentence began with laughter and ended with a plan. There was Jenkins, the kid who couldn't swim, and Lieutenant Parker, whose orders had evaporated with headquarters. Together they called themselves the Boatyard Choir, hammering in rhythm to whatever tune they could hum above the drone of mosquitoes. The tactical problem was simple and fatal. They had no coastal defense. Japanese barges ferried troops easily across narrow straits, slipping past what remained of Allied guns. None of the working launches had firepower heavier than a rifle. The small PT boat detachment had fled toward Australia weeks earlier. Levasseur's group was supposed to maintain equipment for a command that no longer existed. He kept a logbook anyway, page after page of sputtering engine notes, sketches of hybrid gearboxes, and sarcastic comments about fleet modernization with coconuts. When asked why he kept writing, he said it made him feel the war was still organized. The men believed if they kept their hands busy, maybe the front would forget them. But the war remembered. Enemy aircraft harassed the yard daily, strafing what looked like salvage but was still the lifeblood of a besieged island. One evening, while searching for tubing in the wreck of a P-39 Airacobra, Levasseur stood staring at the aircraft's snub-nosed cannon still mounted through the propeller hub. The pilots called it the Flying Punch. Here it sat, half buried in sand, its ammunition gone but its precision mechanism intact. He was joined by Santos, barefoot on the warm metal. They spoke little, just wry comments about how the weapon could sink a boat faster than any rifle could. The idea hovered unsaid, then slipped away under the crack of thunder. Weeks later, as the rations dwindled and official wires went silent, the yard became both prison and workshop. The remaining men scavenged mercilessly. Propeller shafts became drive columns, ration tins became piston seals, and every fragment of enemy shrapnel was flattened into patching plate. No one ordered them to do it. They simply refused to sit still. In another part of the world, engineers worked with blueprints and supply chains. Here, they worked with ruins and nightfall. Levasseur's ordinariness was his secret weapon, a habit of asking, "What if we just tried?" Around him, on the rusting docks, an idea was germinating beneath exhaustion. It would soon turn their mechanics' corner into one of the strangest laboratories of the entire Pacific War. The question was no longer when relief might come. It was how to fight back with nothing but the scraps the tide delivered. Days blurred into a single, sun-bleached struggle. Each morning, the men scanned the horizon for an Allied silhouette that never appeared. By noon, they were bent over gutted hulls whose seams hissed when rainwater touched the hot iron. The Pacific seemed intent on reclaiming everything man-made. Command's last communique had crackled through the wireless weeks ago. Hold if able, and then silence. They were alone, custodians of an island slipping steadily under enemy control. The Japanese methodically advanced along the coast. Barges slid through mangrove channels at night, landing troops who moved inland before dawn. Levasseur and his crew could hear distant artillery like a heart beating somewhere underwater. The men worked in that echo, hammering plates onto broken boats that could not outrun the invasion. Each attempt to repair a standard launch revealed another missing part: valves, bearings, spark plugs once catalogued and now irretrievably gone. Fuel was siphoned and re-siphoned until it smelled more of rust than gasoline. Official Navy doctrine was useless here. The manuals on Parker's desk spoke of supply convoys and depot maintenance. They might as well have been fairy tales. Everything assumed a world still connected by logistics, by authority. Levasseur snorted whenever Parker quoted procedure. "Tell the manual the nearest machine shop's 300 miles north, and enemy held." It wasn't disrespect, merely reality. Wearing a grin to keep despair at bay. Losses mounted in ways small but suffocating. A storm shredded 2 half-rebuilt hulls. Jenkins caught a fever and was evacuated by fishing skiff, the last they saw of him. Enemy recon planes swooped low over the yard, counting the shapes of men too stubborn to hide. Then came the morning the next-to-last functional engine seized in its block. When Levasseur pried it open, shards of piston ring glittered like coins in dirty oil. Without engines, their coastline might as well have been surrender written in salt. They tried diplomacy with physics, aligning mismatched parts by intuition, carving bushings from local wood staves soaked in resin. Every fix was more audacious, every outcome shorter-lived. The engines coughed back to life only to die again. Even Parker's calm began to fracture. "We're mechanics chasing ghosts," he muttered. Silence answered. They were all thinking the same thing, without a miracle. The Yotidur next landing convoy would own the bay outright. It was during one of those oppressive afternoons, air thick as syrup, that Santos slammed a rag across the workbench and muttered, "We need bite, not polish. Bite, firepower, something that could make the enemy think twice before drifting into what remained of Allied waters." The notion lingered, but had nowhere to go. The only heavier weapons near the yard were the rusting aircraft carcasses under palm fronds, their guns unsalvaged because no one imagined attaching them to boats. The technical contradictions were endless: recoil balance, feed mechanisms, structural stress, ammunition scarcity. To even suggest it sounded half mad. Still, madness was easier to live with than surrender. That evening, Levasseur sat outside his hut, logbook on his knees, tracing numbers he knew were wrong because they assumed materials he'd never see again. He listened to the surf pound the jetty stones and realized the rhythm matched the thump of a distant 37-millimeter gun from memory, an engine of defiance. The image came unwanted but unshakable. That cannon mounted where a bow light should be, spitting defiance into the dusk. The bureaucrats and manuals had already failed them. Heroics were collateral now. Improvisation was survival. Levasseur closed his logbook and looked toward the silent hulks glistening under the moon. These were not wrecks anymore. They were beginnings disguised as ruins. Somewhere among the twisted propeller shafts and ruptured plating lay the seed of their salvation. The war had stripped them of tools, orders, and certainty. What it had accidentally delivered was perfect clarity. If conventional method could not protect their shore, then the unconventional must. Defeat had deepened into determination, a stubborn, half-mad conviction that an answer waited inside the wreckage, if only someone dared to build it. The monsoon broke the sky open that night, rain hammering the boatyard roof like artillery shrapnel. Levasseur worked under a lantern, coaxing life from yet another cracked carburetor, when lightning flashed over the airstrip wrecks beyond the fence. In that quick white glare, he saw again the snub nose of the P-39, half buried in sand, a relic waiting for imagination. Earlier jokes about giving it a hull suddenly no longer sounded like jokes. He tore a page from his logbook, sketching a crude outline. Aircraft cannon, reinforced bow, dual engines. It looked absurd, but absurdity had become the only raw material left. By morning the rain had eased, leaving heat so dense the air shimmered above the tin roofs. Parker studied the sketches and rubbed his temples. "It'll rip the boat in half," he said. "If the brass were here, they'd hang us for wasting ammo." Levasseur shrugged. "They're not here, sir, and the ammo's useless where it is." That was the argument's end and beginning. Word spread across the yard like a contagious dare. Santos volunteered to scout the airfield for salvage bolts. Two machinists argued over how to mount a recoil cradle without splintering the hull. Fear lingered beneath the laughter. If they miscalculated by inches, the cannon could recoil straight through the pilot's chest. Yet the hesitation felt smaller than the weight of surrender. Each man faced his own quiet reckoning. They'd sworn to preserve Navy equipment, not to rewrite its purpose. Levasseur knew that if anyone above jungle level discovered their plan, they'd be charged with mutiny or insanity. But secrecy offered freedom. There would be no permission, only proof. He returned to the A2 P-39 wreck that evening, its fuselage steaming in the humid dusk. The cannon mount still sat firm, its barrel pitted but straight. Levasseur ran a hand along the metal, feeling both reverence and defiance. "You had your sky," he murmured. "Now let's see what you can do with water." Pulling the weapon free took 3 days of sweat, rope, and leverage. When it finally came loose, the recoil cylinder sighed like a living thing exhaling. The men cheered softly, half afraid the noise might draw heaven's disapproval. They hid the gun under canvas near the pier, a secret heartbeat pulsing in the shadows. The transformation of an aircraft weapon into a seaborne one defied physics, regulations, and reason. It was not engineering. It was rebellion with a wrench. Levasseur's confidence hardened into calm resolve. "We build it once," he told the crew, "and if it kills us, at least we die moving forward." That line settled everything. No more debates, no officers to convince, just work. Amid the hiss of torches and the clatter of salvage crates began the strange symphony that would echo later across Pacific lore. What they were about to construct existed nowhere in the Navy's imagination. Even now in military archives, the incident survives only as a rumor scrawled in margins. The narration tightens around a single pulse. What they built next, no one dared report. But once night fell on Mindanao, the wrecked heart of a fighter plane would wake again, anchored to plywood, baptized in salt water, and aimed squarely at the impossible. They began before dawn when the air was thick and the jungle still whispering from the night's rain. The boatyard smelled like rust and wet earth. Steam curled from puddles where acetylene torches hissed to life. Levasseur marked chalk lines across the hull of a narrow launch that had once carried mail between islands. The men called it Number 6, though there was nothing orderly about it. Its plywood ribs had warped from heat, its deck peppered with bullet holes. Perfect, Levasseur decided. If it survived this, it could survive anything. They stripped the bow bare and set to work crafting a mount strong enough to tame the aircraft cannon. Every clang sounded like defiance. Santos scavenged a section of wing spar to serve as reinforcement. Two machinists hammered salvaged rivets flat with the backs of axes. It wasn't pretty, but beauty had been rationed out months ago. Levasseur built a cradle out of engine struts, bolted the frame through doubled-up hull planks, and coated the seams with tar until they gleamed under the lantern light. By midday, shirtless under the equatorial sun, they hoisted the gun itself onto the deck using pulley ropes threaded through a palm trunk. As the barrel swung above their heads, everyone froze. A single mistake now could split the launcher apart or crush them flat. The cannon settled into place with a metallic sigh that carried across the inlet. Someone swore softly, almost reverently. The last time that gun had barked, it was in the sky. Now it was a creature reborn in exile. Fitting the recoil cylinder proved harder. The rubber seals had cracked beyond use. Parker, who'd once rebuilt automobile suspensions in Kansas, sliced rubber gaskets from old tire remnants and soaked them in whale oil. Against every practical rule of ordnance engineering, it worked. They filled the chamber with enough fluid to dampen the kick, or so they hoped. Levasseur tightened bolts until his arms shook. "If she jumps off the deck," he warned, "don't try to catch her." Nervous laughter answered him, the kind that keeps fear from showing its teeth. Days turned into a pattern of exhaustion bordered by laughter. When the sun dropped, they lit torches along the rickety pier, shadows flaring like ghosts over the water. Hammer song mixed with the incessant drone of insects. Those hours, the men stopped being engineers or sailors and became something wilder, dreamers with tools instead of sleep. The engines came next. They salvaged a radial from the wreck of a training plane, coupling it with a decrepit truck motor through a homemade gearbox. Levasseur watched the alignment like a surgeon watching a heartbeat monitor, hand steady on the throttle cable. The machine coughed, sputtered, and then roared. Two distinct vibrations collided in the hull, forming a rhythm that felt half music, half fury. "That's the sound of disobedience," Santos grinned, wiping sweat and soot from his face. Structural reinforcement required ballast. With no lead to spare, they filled burlap sacks with stones from the shoreline, layering them along the stern until the keel sat true. It tilted low but steady, just enough counterweight to absorb the gun's recoil. The finished silhouette looked fantastical. Angular, ungainly, its nose armored with scrap plates, scavenged from aircraft cowling, and its aft deck bristling with mismatched pipes for exhaust. Blackened tar lines streaked around the seams like tribal markings. In daylight, it resembled a child's toy built by a hurricane. In shadow, it looked dangerous. The weapon itself demanded ammunition. From the P-39 wreck, they found 15 usable shells, their brass-tarnished primers questionable, enough for one demonstration, or one funeral. Santos polished them with coconut oil until they gleamed dully. "Every round's a sermon," he said. "Make 'em believe." The boatyard became private theater. They rehearsed loading drills, timed to shouted counts. Levasseur obsessed over trigger pull lengths, operating levers, and recoil trajectory. When sleep finally came, it smelled of tar and burnt cordite. Even in dreams they could hear the metallic thump of the gun settling into its cradle. Occasionally doubt crept in. Parker worried the hull would shear apart at first firing. "Maybe it's madness," he confessed. Levasseur's answer was calm. "Then we'd better build it steady. Madness still deserves craftsmanship." That phrase became their mantra. By the final week, their creation was ready. They painted its hull with leftover aviation gray to disguise scorch marks, adding a crude shark mouth at the bow for luck. The nose cannon jutted ahead like a spear, and the smell of fuel filled the yard, an intoxicating mix of danger and hope. Even the tropical wind seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to applaud or mourn. As darkness fell, they rolled the boat down makeshift rails greased with coconut oil. The hull splashed into the shallows and bobbed once, twice, then steadied. A collective exhale followed. The machine beast floated. Levasseur stood at the bow, hand on the cannon, water reflecting torchlight across his face. "She lives," Santos whispered, crossing himself. For the first time in weeks, silence replaced the hammer chorus. The men gazed at what they'd conjured from ruin, a plywood launch reborn into something audacious enough to challenge the tide itself. This was no longer improvisation. It was an act of faith hammered into wood and steel. Behind them, the jungle murmured, oblivious. Ahead lay black ocean and the promise of proof. Soon, they would find out whether genius or disaster waited in the next pull of the trigger. Dawn arrived without fanfare, just a dense fog rolling off the water and the hum of insects trading night songs for day murmurs. The men had agreed on first light, fewer patrols, calmer seas, fewer witnesses if things went wrong. Levasseur wiped condensation from the crude gauge panel and checked every bolt again, though he'd already done it twice. Nerves disguised as diligence, the smell of gear oil mixed with the sharp tang of nerves. Fear always had a scent. They pushed off from the shallows, wading knee-deep until the hull slid free of the sand. The devil boat, though no one dared call it that yet, shuddered forward on uneven throbs of its coupled engines. The sound echoed across the lagoon like twin hearts struggling to beat together. Fog swallowed everything beyond 20 yards. The water reflected gray sky and uncertainty in equal measure. Santos crouched beside the gun, wiping rainwater from the breach. Levasseur, at the tiller, met his eye and nodded once. The first shot came sooner than any of them expected. A sandbar loomed out of the mist, and Santos, half laughing, pulled the trigger just to feel it. The world detonated around them. The recoil slammed the bow back, pitching everyone forward. A gout of mud and seawater erupted from the bar, raining over the men as the boat skidded half sideways. For a terrified second, they thought the hull had split. Then the spray cleared. The boat was still afloat, listing slightly, wounded but alive. Relief overflowed as laughter, ragged and disbelieving. Levasseur's first words were a prayer disguised as profanity. She held. Yet holding once didn't prove anything. Recoil had torn a plank loose near the bow. They stuffed the crack with tarred rope, sweat dripping into the patch as the tropical heat caught up with them. Every instinct said to stop, leave the insanity where it stood successful for a moment. But curiosity in a craftsman is stronger than caution. The second round they aimed across open water. Levasseur eased them into position, steadying the stern ballast. Santos sighted down the barrel with one eye closed against glare. The cannon barked again, deeper and truer. A wall of water leapt 50 yards out, and the hull merely quivered. Even Parker exhaled a stunned laugh. "She's a fighter," he said softly. Yet triumph brought its twin, fear. What if the gun jammed mid-battle? What if a stray spark reached the ammunition box? What if the enemy heard and marked their coordinates? The fog felt suddenly thinner. The silence after the echo, too loud. Each man understood that what had just been proved could not be undone. They now possessed a weapon and responsibility for whatever it demanded. When the ammunition was spent, they drifted in exhaustion, staring at the smoke curling lazily from the cannon's barrel. Oil, salt, and cordite painted their skin. Levasseur dipped a hand into the sea, watching the ripples spread outward, pale arcs vanishing into mist. "We built a monster," he murmured. Santos grinned tiredly. "Better our monster than theirs." On shore again, the boat rested crooked on the rails, sizzling where sun dried its soaked boards. They circled her like new fathers unsure how to hold the child they'd summoned. Shock subsided into wonder, wonder into silent calculation, repairs, improvements, ways to make the impossible reliable. Levasseur noted bullet-point thoughts in his oil-stained logbook: strengthen bow plates, adjust recoil fluid, acquire more shells. A weapon demands refinement. That night, no one slept. Thunder rolled far out to sea, and every rumble sounded like the cannon's ghost calling for another test. The men lay awake listening, hearts drumming with the rhythm of potential and fear. Their unlikely contraption had survived its trial. Next would come something less forgiving than the laws of physics. War itself would decide whether their invention was miracle or madness. Night settled heavy over the Mindanao coast, thick with humidity and silence, broken only by insects and the low churn of two mismatched engines. 3 of the improvised boats lay hidden among mangroves, hulls blending into brackish darkness. Levasseur crouched near the bow of the lead craft, fingers resting on the cannon's cooling jacket. It thrummed faintly like an animal eager to move. Santos checked the ammunition, 15 rounds, each one a gamble the island could not afford to lose. They had chosen this night because enemy barges were due with troop reinforcements. Through a spyglass salvaged from a wreck, Parker watched faint silhouettes moving against the horizon, slow, confident shapes, unguarded through habit. "Range 700 yards, he whispered. Levasseur nodded. The tide was right, the sky clouded enough to cloak approach. Engines low, the small flotilla drifted from cover, their wakes glowing faintly with phosphorescence. Every sense sharpened. The air was so wet it clung to skin. Even breathing sounded loud. Fear didn't feel like panic now. It felt mathematical, measured in range and recoil. Levasseur gripped the trigger handle, jaw tightening. When the barge's silhouette filled the sight aperture, he exhaled and fired. The cannon's roar shattered the night. A flash of orange lit the water. The recoil plunged the bow deep, but she recovered cleanly. One heartbeat later, the ace shell struck. A geyser of flame and steam erupted from the enemy vessel's center mass. Seconds stretched, then screams, a distant chorus carried by wind. Levasseur fired again. Sparks leapt. Another barge listed heavily, its lights vanishing beneath waves. Chaos ignited. Japanese gunners scrambled to respond, but their return fire clawed blind into the dark, tracers curving wide. The devil boats maneuvered erratically, engines thrumming out of sync, speed stuttering yet unpredictable. Santos shouted bearings. Parker fed coordinates. Levasseur adjusted aim with the calm of a man too astonished by success to fear it. Each detonation painted the lagoon momentarily bright as day, revealing the absurdity and genius of the flotilla. Plywood and tar facing off against steel and doctrine, and winning. At 600 yards, they changed heading, skimming parallel to the shore. Bullets slapped the water, snapping through spray. One found the canopy frame above, Levasseur's head, splintering it into matchsticks. He ducked instinctively, grease and sweat streaking his face. Santos whooped, reckless joy cutting through the din. They're running scared of furniture with an airplane's nose. Within minutes, 2 enemy vessels burned, their own fuel feeding the inferno. The third tried an evasive arc northward. Levasseur lined up for a final shot, steady hands on trembling metal. The recoil kicked harder than expected, shaking loose planks along the deck, but the shell struck home. Barge split at the seam, bow pitching under. The glow from explosions danced across the surf, reflecting in the awed eyes of every man aboard. Sudden quiet followed. Smoke trailed toward the stars, blurring into storm clouds. On the intercom wire strung between crafts, Parker's voice came husky. "Confirm hits, multiple, casualties unknown, we're in one piece." The words caught halfway between report and disbelief. Levasseur couldn't speak. He stared at the cannon, barrel smoldering, the smell of hot metal mingling with salt. Around him were contradictions, death and relief, improvisation and victory. Then the radio crackled, a local guerrilla station breaking protocol to send what sounded like praise in Tagalog and static. Somewhere on shore, civilians had seen the fires and cheered. The boats retreated under the cover of smoke. As they slid back into their mangrove refuge, the men slumped into sudden stillness. No one cheered loudly. Instinct warned that too much triumph might offend whatever luck had protected them. Santos finally broke the hush with a hoarse chuckle. "So, did we just invent a navy?" Levasseur smiled faintly. "Let's hope not. One of these is punishment enough." Then he looked toward the faint horizon where the flames still flickered. The phrase, "devil boats," would be born from that glow, coined by enemies who could not understand what had hit them. Their reports described small ghosts with airplane guns appearing from nowhere. To the men who built them, the name felt almost fair. When dawn crept up, smoke still hung over the bay. The first light revealed the damage on their own craft. Splintered boards, one cracked exhaust pipe, bullet holes punched through the aft cover, Yet the cannon, blackened and silent, rested solid. Proof. Levasseur touched the barrel, still warm, and felt gratitude heavier than exhaustion. What they had built out of junkyard fragments had turned the tide of that shoreline, if only temporarily. He looked at his crew, one sleeping on deck, another praying over a spent shell casing, Parker sketching repairs already. In their faces lay something unspoken, a quiet agreement that no matter how long the war lasted, this night would not be forgotten. Across the bay, the last flames guttered out, smoke curling like script across the pale sky. The experiment had graduated to legend. From wreckage and desperation had come a weapon so improbable it needed no official name. The story would move through whispers now, from island to island, soldered into wartime myth, the devilish boats that made the Japanese run. By the time reports of the night raid reached the nearest Allied outpost, the story had already mutated into legend. Phantom boats with airplane guns was how the first intercepted Japanese communique described them, the tone nearer superstition than strategy. Command dismissed it as bad translation until coast watchers confirmed seeing fires along the Mindanao, straits and strange silhouettes moving effortlessly through shallows. Someone added the phrase onibate, devil boats, and the name stuck like salt on metal. Levasseur's unit stayed quiet, repairing hull damage and pretending nothing extraordinary had happened. They knew how bureaucracy worked. Paperwork rarely loved innovation. Still, rumors traveled faster than official cables. Within weeks, snippets appeared in intelligence digests, anonymous indigenous craft-mounting aircraft ordnance. A colonel in Australia circled the note in red and scribbled, "Verify feasibility." That annotation became the faint tremor of institutional awakening. Supplies began to trickle in from sympathetic officers, intrigued by rumor. Fuel drums marked as miscellaneous, spare spark plugs that fell off a shipment. No one asked questions too directly. Levasseur accepted everything with quiet gratitude, knowing curiosity in the right uniform was more powerful than orders. Soon, other stranded crews attempted their own versions. Some strapped anti-tank guns to riverboats, others fixed aircraft machine guns under bamboo covers. Most prototypes sank before leaving their bays, but a handful survived long enough to spread the idea that ingenuity could outweigh tonnage. Enemy records later revealed genuine unease. Japanese patrol reports warned of small, rapid launches firing high-caliber shells, disrupting supply barges. Initiatives to find and destroy the workshops led nowhere. The jungle erased all evidence by the time search teams arrived. For soldiers used to predictable opposition, facing anonymous craftsmen who turned wreckage into weaponry proved demoralizing. Fear warped perception. Reflections on the water became possible threats. Back at the boatyard, Levasseur's group never grew beyond 15 men, but their confidence expanded in proportion to belief. They refined recoil systems, scavenged fresh treen barrels, even built crude silencers from wrapped burlap to dampen echoes. Each success remained unrecorded, each failure buried discreetly beneath mangrove roots. It was an underground chain of innovation, part engineering, part folklore. Higher command, now aware something extraordinary had occurred, dispatched a liaison officer to collect technical particulars. The man arrived in pressed khakis that wilted instantly in the humidity. He inspected one of the boats, scribbled notes, and uttered the bureaucrat's universal verdict, "Interesting, must be standardized." Levasseur exchanged a glance with Parker that said everything. Standardization would kill it. The field conditions, the improvisation, the madness, these were the essential ingredients. Strip them away, and all that remained was theory. Within months, the men were reassigned individually, their workshop absorbed into resupply operations as the campaign advanced northward. No official commendations appeared in Navy records. Still, the ripple had started. The idea that resourcefulness was as strategic a weapon as any sanctioned armory. Later, PT boat crews would adopt aspects of their design without ever knowing its origin. And the legend, still nameless, floated on both sides of the war. To Allied mechanics it was proof, to Japanese sailors a warning whispered before night patrols. What had begun as a secret experiment in a forgotten cove had multiplied into scattered echoes across the Pacific, improvised courage feeding a kind of collective imagination. The Devil Boats, though few in number, had done something official programs rarely achieved: remind ordinary men that genius was not bound by hierarchy or by hope of recognition. It only needed a wrench, a little stubborn light, and someone willing to believe ruined metal could still roar back to life. When the war swung north and liberation fleets retook the islands, the jungle yard that birthed the Devil Boats disappeared beneath a tide of new machinery. Landing craft and bulldozers chewed the shoreline where the makeshift rails had once touched the sea. Levasur's crew scattered, some reassigned to repair duty on bigger vessels, others absorbed by guerrilla units. Only a few ever met again, their friendship reduced to signatures on demobilization papers. The Devil Boats, hurriedly patched and pushed aside, were left to rot among vines and tide pools, their plywood ribs softening back into mud. Levasseur returned to Oregon months later, gaunt, sun-scorched, carrying little more than his logbook and a mechanic's toolbox. When neighbors asked about the war, he mentioned only too much hammering. The official Navy register listed nothing about improvised gunboats at Mindanao. Even Parker's after-action note vanished into a footlocker bound for archives. What survived were whispers told in veterans' bars and the unending rumor that someone once bolted a fighter cannon onto a boat and changed an entire coastline's fate. Decades passed. The jungle reclaimed the boatyard, erasing rust and footprints alike. But memory, like metal, resists total decay. A field researcher in the 1970s stumbled upon a corroded 37mm shell casing being used as a paperweight in a village store. Local elders told him their grandfathers had watched a small boat spit fire at the Japanese fleet. The rumor sparked an investigation. Declassified memos confirmed unauthorized coastal defense experiments, Philippine Theater, 1942. That dry phrase was all that remained of their legend. Eventually, a museum curator on Corregidor pieced together enough fragments to display part of a gun cradle and a photograph of men waist-deep in water, grinning beside a hull so battered it looked ready to dissolve. Beneath the image, a caption reads simply, "Improvised gunboat, unknown crew." Visitors pass without realizing that behind the Ibar understatement lies a story of rebellion, invention, and tenacity, forged when defeat seemed certain. In later naval design histories, there's an invisible footprint, the sudden emphasis on lightweight attack craft, on adaptability as doctrine. Historians debate origins, but anyone who has smelled hot engine oil and salt knows where that lineage truly began. Levasseur never spoke publicly about his creation. He died in 1963. Quiet as he had lived, his logbook still in a drawer beside hand-drawn sketches of hull reinforcements. On one page, written faintly in pencil, are 4 words. She lived. That's enough. And perhaps it was. Every act of innovation leaves 2 legacies, the thing built and the courage that built it. The Devil Boats left their wooden bones to rot and carried their second legacy invisibly into every engineer who faced an impossible shortage and decided to build anyway. Their story might have vanished entirely, submerged by bureaucracy and time, but whispers have a way of surfacing. If you stand on a southern Philippine dock at dusk and listen to the tide lap against the pilings, it's easy to imagine you hear the uneven thrum of twin engines somewhere far out in the darkness, reminding the sea that even scrap can burn bright. Across the Pacific today, the water still glows faintly at night, the same ghostly light that once trailed behind a handmade boat no bigger than courage itself. The men who built that vessel are gone, their names scattered like metal filings in old reports, yet their invention endures in spirit, proof that even desperation can forge brilliance. What happened off Mindanao isn't just a curious footnote, it is a promise to every mechanic, sailor, and dreamer who has ever looked at ruins and seen potential humming beneath the dust. As the final shots of the war fade into the pages of history, the story of the Devil Boats reminds us that heroism isn't always wrapped in metals or carved into marble. Sometimes it's nailed together with borrowed bolts, stinking of tar and aviation fuel, built by calloused hands that simply refuse to give up. Their legacy drifts quietly through time, surfacing whenever ordinary people face impossible odds and decide failure is a luxury they can't afford. If you've listened this far, you belong to that lineage, the keepers of forgotten names, curious enough to ask who built this thing and brave enough to care about the answer. Each retelling rescues their memory from obscurity. So, wherever you are, whether your family served in islands, deserts, or faraway ports, take a moment to let their ingenuity live again in your voice, your comment, your remembrance. Because stories like this survive only when carried forward. Every view, every share, every whispered few remember, stitches one more thread into history's fading fabric. The sea that swallowed their wreck still carries their echo, and for a fleeting instant, when their tale is told, the devil boats rise once more through time, engines rumbling, gun poised at the horizon, defying silence, alive again in memory.